All right, thanks so much for being here. This is a great opportunity to continue some of the previous conversations that we've had related to networking and sharing information as part of the AERA Montessori Education Special Interest Group. These monthly First Friday gatherings for researchers have really been an opportunity to talk about a number of different topics. And the one we're talking about today is looking at publishing in scholarly journals. And so I have just some overarching thoughts and resources to pass along. If you would like to have access to these slides, I have uploaded the PDF to the tiny URL that is linked here so that you can have access to the slides so that you can get into some of those links and things directly. I have here just some screenshots of some journals that are ones where Montessori research has been published over the recent past that might be places to begin your journey as you're thinking about what might be a good home for publications that you might be looking at submitting or that your students might be looking at submitting. So there are a number of publications that have published Montessori work, and that number is growing. So it's exciting to see that the audience and the interest in Montessori related content seems to be growing. So we talked a little bit about who was here and the projects and things that people are working on. So we will skip this slide since we covered that before we started recording. So just in terms, and in my introduction, before we started recording, I mentioned that I'm the founding editor of the Journal of Montessori Research. I'm also on an editorial team for a Bloomsbury Handbook of Montessori Education that is in process to be published in 2023. And so over the past few years, I've really gained quite a bit of experience in my editorial role in terms of identifying areas that can help authors as they're putting their work together. So I've gathered some general writing tips that I think are useful for authors to keep in mind, really, whether you're an experienced author or a new author or a graduate student or you're coaching students yourself. Some of these general writing tips are things that I often find myself commenting on when I'm doing editorial work. So really, keeping in mind what the message is of your research is really key, and recognizing that your message or your story or your contribution is really part of the discourse that's occurring related to your topic. And so it's really important to consider how your research is contributing to that ever-evolving discourse, to place your work within the context of that discourse. The challenge is you have to do that efficiently given space limitations in articles. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how different article preparation is from scholarly documents like dissertations and theses, where you don't have as much concern about the efficiency of using space. But this being conscious of your message within context is important. And it's important to do that efficiently within published work in particular. It's also important to really stay focused throughout every aspect of your paper about what the message is or what the story is. So even as you are preparing the discussion of theory and past research, being really tightly connected to where you're going with your research is really key. And so that's an area that I think I often find students and early career authors being somewhat less rigorous, I guess, in thinking about how they can stay very closely connected to their organizational structure and their main themes really throughout the paper. So it's important to begin with the end in mind as you're writing and ensure that those, even those introductory things, talking about theory and past research, really needs to be tightly connected to the remainder of the paper and the main story that you're trying to tell. And then as you're thinking about preparing the submission, it's really important to be mindful of the particular publication that you're looking at and what their expectations are in terms of gatekeepers. So looking at those submission guidelines, respecting the word limit, the requirements for anonymous submissions, how they want you to handle figures and those kinds of things. So just making the editor's job easier makes it more likely that the editor is going to be amenable to sending it on to further review and consider revise and resubmit rather than sending something through as a rejection just because it may simply be making their job harder if you don't abide by those kinds of things. And the point about accuracy of information is really about making sure that you are accurately representing, particularly the information in your introduction and your literature review, making sure that you are being true to the research that you're citing, so that you are not putting a spin or a conclusion on an author's work that might not actually have been the original intent. So really being clear about particularly citing works within other works, do the work to get to the original citation, and really go to the source where you can, to make the gatekeeper confident in the accuracy of the information you're sharing. The next piece is really being patient and knowing that, and I talk about the review time, but I want to step back and also talk about the writing time. You can't rush writing. While it's easy to get buried in writing and to stall in writing, it's also really important that you give yourself this thinking space to put together a really coherent manuscript before you submit it. So give yourself time even before the submission to really put together a solid submission. And then expect that the reviews do take time. In particular, I can tell you as an editor, it's always tough to get reviewers to respond within the time frame that we ask them to. Under the circumstances that we're in today, with everyone being under extreme pressure and the pandemic continuing to add stress to people's lives, it's even worse. It's harder to get people who are willing to review. And then when those people are willing to review, they often end up needing extensions. So we have to extend a lot of grace to those people who are willing to take on the reviews, so that they'll be willing to do it. But that often does make that turnaround time longer than we would like for it to be. And then anticipate that there will be revisions and resubmissions required. And sometimes, depending on the publication, it may be multiple rounds of that. While it may be easy to be frustrated by that process, have confidence that those rounds of revisions create a better end product. So be patient with that process, because it does improve at every step of the process, even though we would probably prefer that it be a more direct sort of process without all of the back and forth. But that back and forth is part of the thinking related to contributing to the field, and it's important. And then finally, be direct and succinct. I sort of had fun writing this one because I used big words in my description about this one. So avoid lingo and verbosity, because that's not a word you should really use when you're writing. And don't do deep dives into the thesaurus. If it looks like you're trying too hard, it actually makes your work look less sophisticated. So use language and terminology that's comfortable for you. Don't try too hard. Don't pad your words trying to sound scholarly. It tends to backfire if you do that. So I just encourage you to write for clarity, because that's really what editors want to see, is they want to see very clear writing that their readers will be able to access. So and that really applies for any author. I think I should put this on the cover page of the Journal of Montessori Research, because these are tips that I would give really to any author that's submitting. In particular, looking at how to convert graduate papers to manuscripts. This is an article from APA that specifically provides guidance for that. So the link to that is provided here below. And I've broken it down into sort of the beginning part of the article and then the second part of the article. So in terms of thinking about these introductory materials, really the big key, and I laugh because we all get very vested in our words, in our dissertations. And one of the most painful things to do is to remove those words. But that's really what you have to do in order to prepare a manuscript. Dissertations are way longer than a journal manuscript is going to be. And so you have to go in and be brutal and cut some of those words that you agonized over when you created the dissertation to begin with, in order to create something that's of a length that's appropriate for a journal submission. So cutting down to 7,500 words to 10,000 words is where most of the journal word limits lie. In the places that you find needing the most cutting from a graduate paper is in the introduction and the discussion section, so the beginning and the end. In particular, you're not going to see the extensive literature review from a graduate paper in a journal article. So that's the place where you really have to be very selective and incorporate only what's most critical. You can eliminate entire sections or just eliminate text within the sections. You might also consider separating your research questions into multiple different papers. That's a viable path that a lot of people choose to pursue in order to get multiple publications, but also to leverage more of the work that was in the dissertation in multiple publications with different approaches. You have to be careful that you're not simply self-plagiarizing. They have to really be standalone articles where you are creating new work rather than just replicating like your methods section and things like that. So the abstract often tends to also need to be condensed for APA journals and the Journal of Montessori Research. Our abstract word count limit is 250 words. So often that's less than you would find in a dissertation. And then in the introduction, you really don't see an explicit literature review in most journal articles. The literature that's reviewed and provides context for the study is usually within the introduction. And you really have to focus on only those sources that are of immediate relevance to your research questions or hypotheses. So you have to be very selective about what you include. And you need to be sure that you're ending with a clear description of your aims and hypotheses that informed your research questions. So you'll want to make sure that you're including those research questions within that introduction. And then within the methods section, again, efficiency is key. You only convey enough information about how the data were collected and evaluated that is necessary for your reader. You can refer the reader to previous works or other authors or supplemental materials. That's something we use quite a bit in the Journal of Montessori Research. So I've used that for some more sophisticated analysis that we've done to keep the core article at a reasonable length, but provide the details in supplemental materials for those that may want more details. And then in terms of the sort of the second half of the paper, in the results section, again, you just have to be very selective and only report the most relevant analyses that are pertinent to the research question that you are focusing on for a particular article. You want to ensure that the results that you are presenting directly relate to the research questions that you articulated at the beginning of the paper. This is part of that being very clear and consistent with your message throughout the paper. So if you have 3 research questions that you articulate at the beginning of the paper, you're going to want to organize your results within the results section around those research questions. So that's an important way to keep the structure of what you're writing very clear and consistent to make your reader's job easier. Within the discussion section, you have to make sure that you are not making inferences and conclusions and extrapolations with your results beyond what the data suggests. You can make hypotheses, you can suggest directions for future research, but incorporating the limitations of your research design, you need to not overpromise what it is that your results mean to the field. So it's important to keep your limitations in mind and note areas of consensus. How does your work agree with previous work? How does it differ? And then again, acknowledging those limitations that impact how people can rely on your results based on what else has been done in the field. And then in your reference list, you want to, this is really related to the references that you include in that introduction in your abbreviated literature review. You're going to want to use the works that contribute to the knowledge of the particular topic that you're contextualizing. I think when we write graduate papers, we tend to think more is better. And so we want to have lots and lots and lots of citations for research that supports our approach or provides context. But really, you need to be much more efficient in an article and only include those specific sources that are helping you move your argument forward. Think about looking at those reviews of existing research or meta-analyses, because they can be economical ways of summarizing what exists in the field. In a dissertation, you're going to want to go into all of the individual studies that went into a particular review of research, but in an article, you don't have the space for that. And then again, make sure when you're thinking about tables and figures, make sure that they are essential and they're not just extraneous to your argument, and you don't want to duplicate information that's in the text, but make sure that those tables and figures are supporting what's in the narrative. So this rejections, you know, that's what we hate as editors to do, and we hate as authors to receive, but we've all been there. I've been on both ends of that, and I can tell you that it's no fun for the editor to do a rejection, just as it's not any fun to get the rejection. But this is from that same article, looking at some of the most common reasons that manuscripts are rejected. The first one, and is really the one that I see, not most often, but I see it quite often, that the ideas are just not conceptually or methodologically well developed, that there's good thinking there, but it's not as well developed as it should be, either from the theoretical standpoint, which is tough because you have to make the theoretical case for the study in a very small space within journal articles. So you have to be very efficient in how you do that. And then the methodology should also be clearly and succinctly stated, but also have enough, be well developed enough for your reader to really make an assessment of the strength of the research. Missing information that's expected within a research article, I don't see that nearly as often as the other two. But the final one is really related to sort of the strength of the writing, conveying the importance of the content effectively and persuasively. Academic writing is not just dry facts. You're still telling a story. You're still trying to make a point. You're trying to contribute something that is valuable to the field. So oftentimes people don't think about that as being persuasive writing, but it is. It can still be scholarly, but also still be persuasive. And so I think that's probably the place where I see the most weakness in submissions, is that quality of the writing not being as strong in terms of making the reader clear about why this research is important to the field, and why it should matter. So those are kind of the areas that I would suggest that the most work is needed from the submissions that I see. So I often have people ask, you know, how to, and I go about the same decision. I've got an article we're working on right now where we've gone through the process of trying to decide, okay, where do we want to try to submit this? So this is very fresh in my mind. One of the decisions is, do you want to pursue an open access publication, or are you willing to be in a publication that's behind a paywall and generally requires a university library to access it? I've done both. I can tell you that I get a lot more mentions and a lot more reads for my open access publications. And so I tend to seek open access when I can, because I think particularly in the field of Montessori education, we have a lot of Montessori educators and people who are not necessarily connected to universities that are interested in our work. And so I think it's really helpful when we can pursue open access to do that. Connected to that is this item later down on the list, which is the article processing charges, because for many open access publications, you will incur an article processing charge in order to submit to an open access publication. One of the benefits of the Journal of Montessori Research is because it is a publication of AMS through the University of Kansas Libraries. AMS covers and KU cover the costs of publishing the journal. So there are no article processing charges, even though it is open access. So that is a fairly unique aspect of the Journal of Montessori Research. But most open access publications are not, don't have that luxury. So you have to make that decision. I will let you know that sometimes there are grants available that will help you cover the costs of those article processing charges. Often they're in the neighborhood of about $1,000. That's not unusual. Some publications give you the choice. You can submit it either to be open access or not. And so you choose within that publication. These are some of the open access journals, like I think Sage Open, I think is this way. I could be wrong. But some of the open access journals give you the choice of being open access and paying the article processing charge or not. The other thing to look at is what the length requirements are. As there are more digital publications, they tend to have longer word count acceptances. So if you've got a longer piece, particularly if you're doing something like a mixed methods study, mixed method studies tend to be longer because you're trying to cover more territory. And so sometimes length constraints can be a problem if you're talking about something that's a pretty extensive study design like mixed methods. Talked about article processing charges. Impact factor is an issue, particularly if you're going to be going up for a tenure review at some point and you want to make sure you have high quality journals that you're publishing in. It's not a straightforward single measure. So there's a link that I have under resources in a subsequent slide to kind of help you understand the different measures of impact that are out in the field and how you might use those. And then if you're talking about Montessori related research, looking for journals that have had a history of publishing Montessori work is relevant. Making sure that you're not trying to go into a journal that has, for whatever reason, not been open to considering Montessori as relevant to their readership is important. So that's valuable in terms of considering journals where other work has been published related to Montessori education. And these are some of the tools, and this is why you might want to use that tiny URL that I provided at the beginning to get access to these to these links for these tools. APA has a nice website with some publishing tips on it. Reference or recite works. If you are not using one of the citation engines within your word processing system, or even if you are, because I know sometimes you can run into glitches with those systems, a great check at the end before you submit a manuscript is to use this Recite Works website. It will take your manuscript and it will identify any inconsistencies between your in-text citations and your reference list. It will highlight any of those for you. It will even correct your formatting for APA style. It deals with a couple of different styles, but definitely does APA style. So it's just a really useful tool, and it makes the editor and copy editor's job a whole lot easier. And it just creates a more high quality submission when you can double check all of those citations before you submit. This used to be a free resource. They have started implementing a charge. I was very sad to see that it's now something that they have included a subscription charge for, but it's a pretty small cost and it is a really valuable tool. It would be something you could use for your dissertation too. It takes a lot of that really tedious reference checking and automates it. This is the Understanding Impact Factors. That's a live guide from the KU that just has some information about how to interpret impact factors and what they mean. So that's a resource for you there. And then finally, the Directory of Open Access Journals is a really great resource. It's sort of like, you guys may not know this reference, the younger ones of you. It's like the Good Housekeeping seal of open access journals. What's happened is, as the number of open access journals has grown, there have been an increasing number of what we call predatory journals, journals that are that exist solely for the purpose of collecting those article processing charges. without being legitimate scholarly publications. So you kind of have to do your due diligence before you submit to an open access journal. I am constantly being solicited from some of these predatory journals when I present something at a conference where they're encouraging me to submit to their open access journal. But the Directory of Open Access Journals has standards and will only accept journals in their list that meet their standards for not being predatory publications. The Journal of Montessori Research is listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals. And there is another level of recognition from DOAJ, that is their gold seal. And so the Journal of Montessori Research has the gold seal from Director of Open Access Journals. So that's just a good place to go to help you with some of that due diligence if you're considering an open access publication and you don't really know much about the publication itself. So now just to cover some ground related to the Journal of Montessori Research. I'm happy to answer specific questions when we wrap up the last couple of slides here. But basically, we are an online only publication. It's been around since 2015, designed to advance knowledge of Montessori education. We include empirical research studies, critical reviews of the literature, theoretical essays, and for the first time this spring, we have our very first scholarly book review available in this spring's issue. And we look for submissions from diverse disciplines, not just the field of education or psychology, but historians and really across the spectrum. And really the goal is trying to contribute to scholarship for the Montessori community, but also the broader field of education, because articles that are in the Journal of Montessori Research are indexed and available through Google Scholar and through ERIC. It's a way of getting more Montessori research into the academic community so that there's more visibility of Montessori within the field. So if you're considering publishing in the Journal of Montessori Research, we accept manuscripts on an ongoing basis. So there is not a hard deadline. We generally say that if you want to be considered for the spring issue, we would have to have the submission by the 15th of January, and the spring issue comes out in May, and the fall issue comes out in November. And so the last date really for being considered for the fall issue is July 1st. There's no guarantee, particularly with less experienced authors. We often have multiple rounds of review. So sometimes it's not possible, even given those deadlines, to get an article into the very next issue. But because we have that ongoing review process, we always have submissions in the pipeline. A big suggestion before you submit to the Journal of Montessori Research is to look at other things that are in our archives, other kinds of things we've published, particularly with action research. We have published some more rigorous action research studies, so it can be helpful to see how other action research has been presented in the journal. But then also look at other kinds of, outside the field of Montessori education, where you may be, your topic of interest or your approach may be applied to non-Montessori contexts, and looking at that in other outside journals can also be really informative before you submit to the Journal of Montessori Research. And then the specific guidelines about word count and style and making sure that your submission is anonymous and all of those things are available on the author guidelines page for the journal website. So yeah, so I am happy to, I'm going to turn off our recording so we can chat now and see if you have any other questions, either about publishing more generally or specifically about the Journal of Montessori Research. But overall, I hope that this was useful information, and I look forward to our continued conversation. So let me stop our recording here and we can have a chat.